Welcome to the Religious Studies Project, hosted by Christopher Cotter and myself, David Robertson. This podcast is produced in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions. You can visit our website at www.religiousstudiesproject.com. Today we're joined by Professor Kim Knott, who's the Professor of Religious and Secular Studies at Lancaster University. Today we're going to be talking about the concepts of space and locality and the study of religion. Professor Knott was the director of the Community Religions Project from the late 1980s at the University of Leeds, and particularly relevant to what we're talking about today, she wrote a book called Location of Religion, a Spatial Analysis, which was published in 2005 with Equinox. We'll link to Professor Knott's page. There's lots of stuff up there about her work in this area and in the study of Hinduism and all sorts of things up there, so do have a look. But for now, welcome, Professor Knott.
Thank you.
I should say we're recording at the Religion and Society conference in Edinburgh on sacred practices of everyday life, and they've been very accommodating with allowing us access and inviting us along, so thanks to the Religion and Society team just before we get going. Can I call you Kim in the interview?
Of course, yeah.
So Kim, these concepts, space and location, why are they relevant to the study of religion? What was it quite a new thing when you turned your eye on these concepts and started to apply it to the study of religion? What's it done?
Well, whether they are intrinsically important, I suppose, is a matter of debate, although there's some kind of classic areas where they collide, the study of sacred space being the most obvious, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later. But where they emerged in my work was in terms of focusing on religion in context. So my study of religion was always rooted in the idea that context makes a difference, and that we can't fully understand a religious practice, a religious organisation, religious objects, and so on, without really understanding where they're located in the broadest possible terms. And we've been quite good at thinking about where they're located socially. So sociologists of religion particularly have been very attentive to thinking about social variables and their relationship to religion and so on. So we've been good at thinking about social context, much better, I would say, in thinking about that than in thinking about geographical context, the importance of place and space. So that's where it arose for me in my work, and that was primarily because in the work that we were doing in the Community Religions Project at Leeds, our focus right from the middle of the 1970s, when I first became a postgraduate student, was in looking at religions in the local region, in Leeds and Bradford, in the West Yorkshire region. It was a dynamic religious scene at the time. The growth of religious plurality was very evident, and certain streets and places within Leeds and Bradford were very multi-religious. You could walk up a street and you would pass by innumerable different places of worship. People jostled with one another in particular neighbourhoods. They were different religious backgrounds and so on. And that the vitality of that religious plurality was very striking. We wanted to study it. We knew that we looked at it in part through the frame of community, but I think also we were attentive not in a very overt way, but with a certain level of awareness of the importance of locality. But it wasn't really until I worked particularly on the Hindu community. Others worked on Sikhs, Orthodox communities, Polish Catholics, Muslim communities. We worked on a lot of communities, but I would say it wasn't really until maybe the mid-1990s that we began really to take the location itself seriously. So we had a project that we got funding for to look at interreligious social action in the city of Leeds. And the notion of the city of Leeds, the concept of the city, but the concept of Leeds as a city was a very important part of that study. And at the end of that project, we ran a conference it was called Religion and Locality. And I think it was in running that conference, beginning a conversation about religion and locality and what difference locality makes to religion, as well as how religion can change the face of a locality, that we really began to develop an agenda for thinking locally and spatially. The other thing that we did at that time was that we established an undergraduate module, although some master's students also took it, called the Religious Mapping of Leeds. And in that, it was a teamwork module in which a small team of students would take a neighbourhood within the city of Leeds and explore that in depth, explore religion in depth in that neighbourhood, looking at the interface between religious organisations, and I admit it was organisationally focused rather than looking at the theme of this conference, that sort of everyday life level, and maybe the more private, family-based religiosity. So organisationally rooted, but looking at the way those organisations intersected with broader social, political, economic, educational, cultural issues in that neighbourhood, and looking at the way they shaped and formed one another. And the students over the years have studied many areas in Leeds and even gone back round to study some of the early ones we started with in the 1990s. So when I had a study leave in, I think it was 2001, I envisaged that I would write a book about religion and locality. And my aim was, I'd really, in a way, become quite disinterested at that stage in thinking about religion, the location of religion in formal religious places, and wanted to turn my attention to how and where religion was located in ostensibly secular locations. And I meant by that, in a quite kind of down-to-earth, common-sense way, that could be anything from the corner of my street, the local park, to a restaurant, to secular public institutions or whatever. So at that stage I wasn't thinking very specifically about what the secular might mean. So my aim was to look at the location, to really investigate the location of religion in ostensibly secular locations. And when I began that project, I realised that that really requires two things. It requires us to interrogate the notions of the religious and the secular. Is there a boundary between them? What can we mean by secular spaces in that context? So part of the book, the 2005 book that you mentioned, was to begin to think about that relationship. And of course that's gone on to be a really important area of concern in the study of religions, and I remain very interested in it. But the other aspect was that I had no tools for doing the task of location. So, if you want to locate something, you have to have appropriate methodological tools to do it. How do you find a needle in a haystack? There's a strategy for doing that. So I actually had to develop the tools for doing that. And I thought I would be able to go away and pull some tools, if you like, off a shelf. Particularly, I thought maybe geographers would have produced something I could use to go about this act of locating religion in these locations. So I read avidly in the geography of religion, and I probably became one of the best, the most knowledgeable people about what had been written in the geography of religion over the last 30 years or so at that time. But I realised they didn't really provide me with the kind of approach that I needed. I realised that actually geographers of religion had been exercised by thinking about religion and not thinking about space or location, because that was taken for granted in their world. People were theorising space, but they were sort of progressive geographers.
Just to cut in here for a moment, these concepts, space, place, location, they're quite, I'll use the term fuzzy words. In what sense are we using, particularly space? I mean, I think we all know what we mean by location, but what is a religious space? And is it one particular thing, or I assume there are numerous interpretations of what space means?
One of the most important things that happened really in the 1990s was the idea of challenging Cartesian notions of space. So the idea that space is physical, space is about the positioning of things in a particular location, but also a very abstract notion of space, in which we tend to think of space as a kind of backdrop against which things happen, but without giving any, I don't think we can say without giving any agency to space exactly, because space isn't animate in quite that sense, but at least thinking in those abstract notions, we fail to take seriously, for example, the way power runs through space. But in the 1990s, people were starting to theorise space, using the work particularly of Michel Foucault, who'd written about power and knowledge and space, a very influential lecturer in the late 1960s, but also the work of Henri Lefebvre, who was a kind of a social philosopher, very influenced by Marxism and the French tradition, but he wrote a very well-known book in the 1970s called The Production of Space, which was translated in 1991. It was really the translation of these works into English was very important, I think, for the development of the work within progressive geography to conceptualise space. So what does it mean? It's really, if we take the work of Doreen Massey, who was a key geographer who was informed by the work of these theorists, it's a dynamic space. Space is dynamic. It's infused with power. Social relations run through it, across it, within it. It's social space. It's not simply a physical space like a container in which things happen. It has, and this is me then really building on the work of people like Massey and Foucault, it has time running through it. It is interconnected. Any individual particular part of space, a place, is interconnected with many other places of a similar nature and of a different nature, globally, and back through time into the future.
Yeah, you'd mentioned in your article, I was reading it, space can be synchronic and diachronic.
Synchronic and diachronic, yeah.
Okay, so anyway, back to you were about to launch into the methodology that you developed.
Right, well really, I suppose what happens in a lot of scholarship is that there are people who are theorists, and then there are people who do empirical work, but there has to be have to be ways to bridge those two arenas in scholarly life. So we depend upon theorists to make their work accessible so that we can use it in empirical studies of religion. But often the two fail to meet. And what I needed in the kind of work that I was doing in order to progress this project of locating religion in secular context was to develop a methodology. How do you use a theory about space in looking at case studies? So I turned those theories. I welded and melded and teased and drew on in various ways the work of Lefebvre, de Certeau, Michel de Certeau, Foucault, and the work of some of these progressive geographers to make a spatial methodology. And I've written about it extensively in a number of articles and so on. And it really, there are 6 parts to it, maybe, 5 or 6, depending how you see it. But it starts with the body, embodiment. And perhaps I should just say about that this notion of space takes seriously the idea that we understand ourselves and our relationships with other people and the physical places that we inhabit through the body, through the fact that we are embodied and that our bodies are spatially organised. They have parts. They have an up and a down, a left and a right, a back and a front, and that those become preconceptual notions that we then draw on in our language, in articulating our social relationships, in thinking about who we are and where we are in the world, and in talking about ourselves and others, our relationships with others. So that spatial element is fully embodied, and that's really the foundation for thinking spatially. But then I progress, and I don't know how much you'd like me to go into this, but to thinking about the dimensions of space, its physicality, social aspects, its mental aspects, discursive aspects, the properties of space, and I, just to mention them very briefly, that extensive quality that I talked about, this diachronic quality of time moving through space. It's the synchronic element of simultaneous spaces related to one another, globally as well as locally and nationally. The way in which spaces configure things together. So in a place you will find many smaller units, parts of space to be found. Places, as Heidegger said, they gather things together. And then the fourth of those properties is the property of power and the way that runs through space. And then another really important aspect, which I won't dwell on here, but it really draws on Lefebvre's work in thinking about different modes of space. So I developed it into quite a complex methodology, which has advantages because it can give you a deep contextualization of a particular place and the way religion operates within it. But it's hard work if you want to employ it systematically. It takes a long time.
Yeah. Could you maybe give us a tangible example of applying this? I know I've certainly read about, there was a particular street in Leeds, but you may want to use something else that you might feel is a better, just how we go about using this methodology and what it told you in that particular place and time. Okay.
Well, I've used it in relation to a variety of different kind of case studies. So in the book, my intention really was to look at a body part, a thing, an object, a place, a community, and an institution using this methodology. But of course, I neglected to think about how long it would take me to do that. I started with the body part, which in this case was the left hand, and it was fascinating, and the methodology was so drew out so much that it took me half a book to do that, and so that was my first case study. Then I've also had funding to look at it, to use the methodology looking at public institutions, so a high school and a medical centre. And I've written a couple of articles with a colleague on the medical centre, and I have recently been writing up the one on the school. As you say, I've also used it to look at a high street, and maybe that's the one I'll unpack for you now. But I've continued to use it in various ways in relation to different case studies. And other people have subsequently also drawn on it to look at their own interesting examples. So somebody working on a hospital in Norway, for example, who's used the study. People have been using it in Canada and so on in relation to their own work. If we just think about the street then. So the first idea is would be to think about that the way in which bodies occupy and inform the street, the way in which so if we're thinking here about what's the location of religion in this particular street, I suppose we would partly be thinking about religious bodies, so the way in which religion inflects the body, and then the movement of those bodies through the street. But also we should also bear in mind something which Lefebvre makes very clear, which is that all spaces take their starting point in bodies, and streets are no exception. So, no street is separate from the idea of the bodies that made it, both producing it as, say, the workers who made the street, who laid out the road and so on, but also the dimensions of the street, which are absolutely informed by human uses of it. So the fact that
doors are certain heights,
doors are
certain ways.
Absolutely, very, very concrete ways in which the body informs a space. But it's also the case that religious bodies may inform that street, the physicality of the street, the physical nature of it. So, and the most obvious ways would be the way in which the body shapes the production of places of worship in the street. Some of those will, of course, be purpose-built places, but some of the others may have been shaped and formed with other kind of bodies in mind. So you can never separate religion out from the other dimensions.
No.
So the body is one way of thinking, and that will take us so far. But then if we think then about the dimensions of the street, the ones that I mentioned, physical, social, and mental or discursive. A street very obviously is physical, so let's not go there. But a street is very much a social location, and the social relationships that take place in the street are spatial too. So even if you think about us engaging in this conversation now, this is a social space as well as it being a physical one, and it's inflected and informed also by the mental work we're doing within it. So these multiple dimensions are giving the space its character in part, and the street is exactly the same. Thinking about the discursive element then of the street, think about the way in which the streets that have been shaped and formed by media discourse, by the narratives that people tell of the street, by the maybe songs and folk traditions that may be told of that street. So you can't really understand that space unless you think about those representations of it that we get, those mental representations of it that we get in a variety of different domains, really, cultural domains. And some of those, the air conditioning has just gone off.
I'll make it much clearer. No, I don't want to.
But some of those mental representations will, of course, be religious. So places they can acquire special religious significance, or it can be that they are understood that religion is part of their formation, along with, say, their ethnic character, or maybe intersecting with some other mental representations of space, a space of crime, or a pastoral space, a natural landscape, or whatever. So again, it depends how you define religion and the relationship between the religious and the secular, but religion can form a part of those mental representations just as well as any other kind of human endeavour. And then the properties, those 4 properties I talked about, I won't dwell on all of them, but I always think the historical one, the extensive aspect, is really interesting, because I would never want to look at a space, as somebody who's trained in the history of religions, I would never want to think deeply about a particular place, a street or whatever, without understanding how it was historically formed, shaped, and what traces may still be present of what de Certeau would say is those earlier regimes. Those earlier regimes still lie there in the stratification of that street. So whether it's within the built environment or within texts about the street, you'll find, the history will be built in there. And in the case of the street that I talk about in Leeds, that its history is an intriguing one of migration. So it was very much a migratory route. And that history is very much built into how we think about the street today. So that's one of the properties. There are lots of others. But I think maybe I've done enough, really, to show you how one could use that methodology, and there's more to it, but to really think in depth about the place and the way that the vitality of that place and the way religion may operate within that.
Yeah, because we just don't think about it in our day-to-day lives, really. You just go about your life, and just listening to you there, we're in Edinburgh, I was just thinking about Princes Street, and there's so many, it's like, what do I think of when I think of Princes Street? And I'm thinking, film Train Spotting, I'm thinking Princes Street Gardens, and there's faith gatherings and all sorts of things,
And I think, even if one adopts quite a conventional, substantive understanding of religion, maybe thinking about religion, in terms of its organisational, institutional forms, you can still, there's still a lot of work you can do thinking spatially. So even if you're not restricting yourself to actual religious buildings, think about the way in which religious representations assault us in arenas of consumption, in shopping malls or in restaurants. The way in which religious metaphors are at work within spaces, to charge them with a particular character, to make people think about them differently, to make people attracted to them in various ways. So there are all sorts of ways, and even in using quite a formal definition, we can find something interesting thinking spatially.
Yeah. Okay. Time is moving on. It'd be really good if we could talk about these. Well, the dynamics here between, let's say, sacred spaces and secular spaces, MultiFaith spaces. What MultiFaith? I think someone said yesterday that there are now. It was Linda Woodhead was saying that there are now 1,500 MultiFaith spaces in the UK or something, which is just staggering. But what do these do to our notion of a space being sacred? If different groups are using it at different times for different things, if you have a secular university campus or something, and people still having prayer rooms and stuff, is that a sacred space? Is it a secular space? And the thing is, Steph Burns' work at the British Museum, and an exhibit of sacred artifacts in a secular museum, and people's religious experiences can profane their sense of the secular as being sacred, and all sorts of things. I know I've just thrown a whole bunch of things at you there.
You have.
I would like to hear you talk about it in a more articulate way.
Well, I think one of the issues that's raised by the plethora of things you've mentioned is the importance for us as scholars in really trying to pin some of these things down. That's not to say that we should think of religion, the secular or the sacred, as having a particular meaning for all time, but that we at least we have to, in our own work, operationalise a definition, a working definition that we can then use. And I've obviously done that in my own work, and I'm not going to talk about the way I've defined those things now, but I don't think we can really embark on answering those kind of questions unless we do make some choices and decisions, which we then, of course, when you go to a conference, people ply you with critical questions. Well, why have you seen it that way? Don't you think it would be better to do this, and so on? And we just have to live with the fact that we have to make those kind of strategic decisions about how we define things. So in my own work, I've wanted to keep all these words in play, religious, secular and sacred. Yeah. But I want absolutely to be able to I believe that the sacred as a category, using Durkheim as a starting point, the sacred is a category that transcends the boundary between the religious and the secular. So to me, it's not going to do, and I'm not going to give you a full account of why, but it's not going to do to say that that the sacred can only be identified and located within ostensibly religious domains. So to me, it's as likely that one will come across sacred places and values and beliefs, or maybe not as likely, but it's at least very likely that one will find those things in arenas that one would have said were secular, as likely as it would be in religious ones. So I'm open to the possibility, and that's why that study of the left hand, for example, was a case in point. It certainly raised questions for me about the sacred, that hands, which these days I think we would think of as pretty mundane, if not profane, although they can be involved in profaning as well as sacralizing activities, that people would generally think of them as pretty everyday anyway, that we could disclose all sorts of sacred activities within those hands. If we move to multi-faith spaces, which are also complex spaces, and as you say, people, and particularly in the point that Linda was making, where she was talking about there being 1,500 of them in Britain, and she was also saying that some of them they don't seem always to be very special places. Some of them, I think she said, they have soil pipes, and they might, there may be just whitewashed walls, and they're not necessarily designer spaces, although some of them are. Are they, what kind of spaces are those? What's the multi-faithness? What is multi-faith about them? What kind of spaces are multi-faith spaces? Are they secular or are they religious? Again, I think you can, depending on your definition, you can talk about them as either one or the other. But I think they are intriguing contemporary attempts to situate, to make a place for a range of different, sometimes contesting identities in areas that are ostensibly secular, in recognition of the fact that people may lead parallel, if not parallel and maybe intertwined religious lives, but not necessarily wish to engage in some kind of interfaith project. So they're very often required by law, or at least, if not formally required by law, they are a response to equality legislation and the fact that people of all faiths and none should have space made available for them in certain locations, contexts, airports, hospitals, educational facilities, shopping centres, football grounds. There'll be multi-faith spaces at the Olympic sites, of course. That equality legislation really requires that, but doesn't require people to actually engage in informal encounters with one another to develop some kind of new spirituality or new forms of the sacred that are of an interfaith nature. So they are multi-faith, not interfaith. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to separate out those kind of ideas. But for many of the users, but not all, so some of the users will be very happy that it's a space where they can practice their own separate identity and go away again and never meet anybody else in the space. But for others, particularly, it has to be said, some Christian chaplains of various kinds, various denominations, it's a space of promise of some kind of encounter. So, and this is one of the aspects of space that I didn't talk about in the methodology, is to think about whether a place has emancipatory or liberation, potential for liberation or transformation. And a multi-faith spaces, for some of the users, are seen as having that kind of possibility of transformation, where people would come together and maybe share their experiences, if not sharing worship, then at least engaging and learning from one another and so on. But I think it would be idealistic to assume that all multi-faith spaces take that form.
Definitely. I'm going to say finally, but obviously if there is anything else you want to talk about, I'm happy to hear it. I wanted to bring up the internet, which I think in the context of talking about a multi-faith space, it is maybe the multi-faith space of our time. And what has the internet, what impact does it have upon this sort of concepts of space and locality?
Well, I think virtual space opens up it opens up some new territory for thinking spatially, but in a way the complexity of ways of thinking spatially before, we already had the tools for thinking about the nature of virtual space. Because if you think about it, when you think about space, you're not only thinking about physical space, you're thinking about space metaphorically. We think about inner space, so the space of the mind, the space of the imagination, as well as thinking about social space and physical space. So we already had the resources for thinking metaphorically and imaginatively about space. And virtual space, in a sense, is an extension of those kind of operations. Yeah. But virtual space, no less than all the other kinds of things we've been talking about, even if it's not physical as such, it is certainly social. It's certainly mental. Representations of space are at work in a cyber context. But also it can be a gathering place, and it can take what look like physical forms. So you can translate the physical into a virtual context. If you think about the way Hindu temples, for example, have been manifested online, and people can practice in those temples, they can have aesthetic and sensory experiences really through in that virtual context. So we've tried to use those that virtual space to mirror much of what we find in the natural and physical environment. I would really query the idea, I think, of whether we can say that they have as yet become multi-faith, or at least interfaith spaces, because I think they suffer from exactly the same kind of issues that we have offline.
Yeah.
And people still follow their friends. I mean, what's Facebook all about? It's about, it's often about building communities of like-minded and already related people. Of course, there's the opportunity to crisscross and extend beyond your existing networks. But you don't always. And I think there's a certain degree of happenstance and possibility within the online space, where those kind of potential extensions and synchronicities and so on become possible. But I think it's easy to over-egg that and to assume that that's commonly what's going on. Much of what those studies of online and offline religion have told us is that there's a lot of continuities between the two, really. But nevertheless, I think it can extend the way we think about space, and it can open up some new theoretical possibilities for us, as well as obviously new ways to think about the way religion is being practiced, and the way it's the way it's socialising, and the way identities might be being formed, and so on.
Yeah. Well, we could, I think, go on for hours here and really open this up some more, but it's been a wonderful introduction. We've got coming up in the next few interviews, I'll be interviewing David Morgan about material religion, we've got Tim Hutchings about digital religion, so these are all sort of interrelated and interconnected, so I think we're going to have a really nice series sort of problematizing this notion of space and opening it up and opening people's minds, the space of their minds. So thank you very much, Professor Knott, for talking to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You've been listening to Chris talking to Kim Knott on the subject of religion and space. And that was the final part of our series on material or embodied religion. And in the name of transparency, we should point out that Chris is about to have Kim as his supervisor when he starts his PhD at Lancaster University very soon. So best of luck, Chris, and our deepest sympathies, Kim. Next week, we have Tim Hutchings talking to Jonathan about religion and the internet. But of course, before that, on Wednesday, we'll be publishing a response to Kim's interview, this time by Katie Aston, who you may remember from several of our roundtable discussions. As always, we'd like you to get involved on our Facebook page, in comments on the website, or on our Twitter, Project RS. If you access this podcast through iTunes, please rate us. It'll help us get this project out to a lot of people who wouldn't normally come into contact with it. And, as always, thanks for listening.